Hello and welcome to our program to mark the Cambodian Genocide. My name is Thorin Tritter. I'm the Museum and Programming Director at the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, which is located in Glen Cove, New York. Today, as I'm sure many of you know, is Cambodia's National Remembrance Day, an annual commemoration of the Cambodian genocide perpetrated by the Khmer Rouge that ruled the country between 1975 and 1979. It remains 50 years after the end of the genocide, still a politically charged and powerful day. I was reading up about it, and as far as what I read, I saw that it was first celebrated in Cambodia on May 20th, 1984, but at the time was called the National Day of Rage, or the National Day of Hate against the genocide or against the Khmer Rouge. In 2001, the day was officially renamed as the Day of Remembrance. Before I introduce our panelists to tell us more about the events in Cambodia in the 1970s and the larger context of political violence in Southeast Asia in the post-war period, I want to first step back and put in an advertisement for some of our other upcoming virtual programs. This coming Sunday at 3 p.m., HMTC is partnering with the National Holocaust Museum in Amsterdam for a virtual screening of an award-winning documentary about the hidden child survivor, Leo Ullman. And then after the film screening, Leo Ullman is going to moderate a panel that includes the descendants of a number of the rescuers, or the descendants of the rescuers who saved him and his family in Amsterdam during the Holocaust. Then next Tuesday at 6 p.m., we'll be holding a virtual book discussion with historian Edward Westerman about his new book, Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, which was published by Cornell University Press earlier this spring. The book has been getting quite a bit of publicity and press, including comments from Thomas Kuhn, the chair of the Strassler Center of Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark University, who described it as a must-read to understand how ordinary men could become mass murderers. So I hope you'll join us to hear about that important new book. And one more program to mention, I want to invite you to join me and my colleague Helen Turner, our Director of Education, as we offer a virtual tour of our core exhibition. That's next Wednesday at 1:30. As always, you can find information about these programs and all our full schedule of virtual activities and programs on our website at www.hmtcli.org, and then click on the Events tab. And of course, I'd be grateful if you'd also click on the Give Now button on our website. Okay, enough of the advertisements. Let's get to tonight's program. Just click a few buttons there. Sorry about that. We have two experts with us this evening who can help us understand the Cambodian genocide and its larger implications. Yves Zucker and Ben Kiernan, both of whom teach at Yale University. Yves Zucker is a lecturer in anthropology at Yale University. She also serves as the president of the Center for Khmer Studies at Yale and is a board member for Yale's Genocide Studies program and the New York Southeast Asia Network. Much of her recent scholarly work is focused on how communities recover and remember mass atrocities and mass violence. And she has conducted extensive research on the aftermath of the Cambodian genocide and the Holocaust. Her first book was published in 2013 and was entitled Forest of Struggle, Moralities of Remembrance in Upland Cambodia. But she has authored and co-authored 3 other books since then, including, most recently, the book at the heart of today's program, which came out last month, Political Violence in Southeast Asia. The other speaker today is Ben Kiernan, the A. Whitney Griswold Professor of History and a Professor of International and Area Studies at Yale. He served as the chair of Yale's Council on Southeast Asia Studies and was the founding director of the Genocide Studies program at Yale, which under his direction established the Documentation Center of Cambodia, uncovered the archives of the Khmer Rouge secret police, and has won multiple internet awards. He's written several books specifically about the Pol Pot regime in Cambodia, but may be best known for one of his broader books, Blood and Soil, A World History of Genocide and Extermination from Sparta to Darfur, which won a number of awards, including the Independent Publishers Gold Medal for the best work of history and the U.S. German Studies Association's prize for the best book dealing with the Holocaust in its broadest context. I'm very grateful to have both of these scholars and experts with us today, and I invite them to turn on their cameras and join me on the virtual stage. Just one other word before we get started, and that is I have a few questions that I want to pose to our guests, but if you have questions, I ask you to use the Q&A feature of Zoom, and we'll make sure to set aside some time at the end of the discussion to get to your questions. So I hope that you'll post your questions. Okay, well, with that introduction, maybe I will start with you, Professor Zucker. I hoped maybe to ask you about the background for this book that's at the heart of our program this evening, that you and Professor Kiernan edited. How did the book come about? Why do you think there's a need for it, perhaps? And maybe you could tell us a little about the reaction you're getting to it.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Thorin. Thank you for having us today, and thanks to the museum as well, and thanks to everyone who is watching today. We really appreciate it. Yeah, just one small correction on the introduction. The Center for Khmer Study is not based at Yale. It has offices in Cambodia and in New York.
My apologies.
Entity. So the background of the book, one of the key things with the background of the book is when the idea for it came into fruition. And that year was 2018, around the beginning of 2018, maybe even late 2017, but mostly 2018. And as you might recall, that was a fairly volatile year in the world. There were a lot of things happening during that period. There was authoritarianism was on the rise, and democracy was in decline, you could say. In fact, it was of such concern at the time, these really noticeable shifts around the world, that some of us at Yale actually formed a small sort of research discussion group, or, around the questions of, is democracy in decline, and what does this mean exactly? So that was the context, and at the time we had the three world powers, all with authoritarian leaning leaders, Trump and Xi Jinping, and also, of course, we had Putin as well. But there was that going on, but also at the same time, if you look towards Southeast Asia, there was quite a lot going on there as well that was very concerning. It was the year of the national election in Cambodia, which Hun Sen won entirely, and that had a lot to do with the fact that all the opposition was pretty much wiped out through a number of tactics that were used. He, was flexing his muscle as a leader and his party. So without any opposition, he won the election. That was in July. At the same time, you had the situation in Myanmar where the Rohingya were being persecuted, mass killings, we call it genocide even, was taking place with massive dislocations, and the army was part of that. And they were acting with impunity in the course of that. Meanwhile, you had in the Philippines, you had Rodrigo Duterte, the president of the Philippines, who is waging his war on drugs. And in that war on drugs, he was killing thousands, continues to, and he actually admitted to doing so that year as well. In the meantime, lots of unrest in Thailand, military in power, and protests and increasing surveillance and continued violence against the Muslims in the South, and a lot of impunity going on there. And and these are just some of the things that were taking place. And so it was within that context, really, with this massive amount of political and social flux and violence happening, and also the potential for more violence to happen, given given all the uncertainties and these sort of tectonic shifts that were taking place in the world, that we thought it's a good time to sort of look at Southeast Asia again and look at what's happened there since the end of World War II, really, in terms of political violence, and see where we are now. There was one other thing that was really important to that sort of line of thought, and that's that there's a lot of new scholars coming in right now into the Southeast Asian studies and into the field that studies political violence in the area. So that was really exciting. We wanted to hear what they had to say. We also wanted to have what's happening now is a lot of issues that weren't covered before are now being covered, violent events that didn't get the same kind of academic attention as they did, as some other ones have in the past. So those were included also. And then at the same time, we wanted to bring in some of the more established scholars also, who were also doing some new and important work. So it seemed like a very good time to do a book project. So with that in mind, we held a conference in December of that year with 24 participants from different places in the world. And the countries that were included in that conference were cases that came from Indonesia, from the Philippines, from Thailand, from Cambodia, from Vietnam, and let's see, one more I'm forgetting, and Myanmar, of course. And these were people who were coming from a variety of disciplines. Some were political scientists, some were historians, some were anthropologists, some worked in law. So we had quite a few different disciplines also being represented there at the conference. So we held the conference, and had some very good and important discussions, both before, during, and after, and then proceeded into the book project. So that's the background, really, of the book.
Excellent. And I will say that the book covers a lot of different cases and a lot of different areas, and yet the Cambodian story really does come through as one of the central stories of the book. And maybe I'll turn to you, Professor Kiernan, here, and ask you to give us some of that historical background of what happened in Cambodia in the 70s and why this day is so honored as National Remembrance Day. And perhaps also, if I could ask you to broaden outward from Cambodia, as you do in the book, to give us some sense of the connections between the events in Cambodia and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. Oops. Let's just get you to unmute that. There we go.
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, and also for having this discussion about the book. The other interesting development that happened just after we concluded the conference, and as we got started on writing the book, was the judgments of the UN-sponsored tribunal in Cambodia, which came, I think, 2 weeks after we gathered for the conference, which found the surviving top leaders of the Khmer Rouge government of the late 1970s, who'd been on trial for genocide. It found them guilty of 2 genocides in that period of the late 1970s. And the judgments were published a few months later in full, several thousand pages, 2,500 pages of detailed evidence about the 2 genocides against ethnic and religious minorities in Cambodia, the ethnic Vietnamese and the ethnic Muslim Cham minority. And so this was an important development in international law, as well as an important documentation of Cambodian history. And it was also the case that another legal case that went back a lot further, right back to 1947, when the Dutch colonial regime was attempting to reimpose itself on Indonesia, the Dutch East Indies, as it had been called before the Second World War. After the war and the victory over Japan, the Dutch forces returned to Indonesia and attempted to re-establish their power there. And the Indonesians declared independence and fought for their independence. And in one case, in the island of Sulawesi, the Dutch forces killed approximately 200 people in a number of villages in Sulawesi. And the case of these mass killings that took place eventually went to court with the widows and children of and survivors of this massacre. And I think it was in 2019 that the International Court of Justice, or was it actually a Dutch court, I believe, actually found in favor of the survivors and the victims of this massacre and ordered the Dutch government to pay reparations for this case of mass violence against the Indonesian civilians who had been subjected to this colonial mass murder. And so we have a development from 1945 to 2018, 2019 of legal reparations, legal accountability in Southeast Asia, both national and international justice coming to bear on these cases of mass murder. Now, there are also a number of cases, like any large region of the world. Southeast Asia has been the site of a number of cases over the centuries. Over the last 5 centuries, we can point to cases of genocide or genocidal massacres, like you can, I think, for any other part of the world, Africa, South Asia, East Asia, or Europe. For instance, the Vietnamese conquest of Champa in the 15th century, the genocidal massacres of the Burmans against the Mons, and indeed Mons against Burman civilians, indeed in what's now Myanmar, and massacres as the Vietnamese pushed south, having conquered Champa, reaching Cambodia. Cambodians conducted massacres against Vietnamese in the 18th century, and Vietnamese conducted in their attempted colonization of Cambodia, mass killings of Cambodians in the 1830s. So there are precedents for the cases that we study in the book, which is political violence in Southeast Asia since 1945. But these earlier cases were linked together, I think, not politically or by other factors that really link them, except by long-term historical conditions. Those cases that I just mentioned over the last 500 years were cases where expanding powers were moving south along the coast, like Vietnam or Burma, or in the case of Java in the 17th century, there was a massacre of Muslim clerics by the Javanese monarch. And that was the case where Islam was moving into Java by sea, and the Javanese expanding kingdom conducted mass murder against an influential new religion. So it was these long-term historical links that were made similarities between these earlier cases. But after 1945, there were much closer, sometimes even personal links between the cases of mass murder that we look at, the political violence that we look at in Southeast Asia. As the world became more closely connected and so on, the Southeast Asian countries interacted much more closely with one another. And so we have the case, for instance, in Cambodia, which I mentioned before, the massacres and genocide against the Muslim minority, the Chams, from 1975 to 1979, by the very secretive Pol Pot regime. The Khmer Rouge leader was Pol Pot. the only international head of state to visit the Pol Pot regime was Ne Win, the military dictator of Burma, now Myanmar. And he visited Cambodia under Pol Pot in 1977, in November of that year. And he met with Nguyen Chia, Pol Pot's deputy, and Khieu Samphan, the head of state of Democratic Kampuchea, the Pol Pot regime. He met with each of them 4 times, the dictator of Burma, Ne Win. He may also have met with Pol Pot, but it wasn't announced that he did so. It wasn't publicly announced. He returned to Rangoon, the capital of Burma, in November 1977. And within months or even weeks, he began implementing what was called Operation Naga Min, a operation of ethnic cleansing of the Rohingya Muslim minority in Burma. Just after being in discussion with, on 4 occasions, Nguyen Chia and Khieu Samphan, Nguyen Chia was later convicted, as I mentioned, of genocide of the ethnic Cham Muslim minority in Cambodia. And Ne Win started to crack down on the Muslim minority in Burma almost immediately after returning from Cambodia, where such a genocide was taking place. And by May 1978, 6 months after Ne Win's return from Cambodia, about 200,000 Rohingya Muslims had fled Burma into Bangladesh. And there was a second crackdown in the 1990s. Another 200,000 Rohingya Muslims were forced to flee for their lives into Bangladesh. And of course, as Eve mentioned earlier, was an outbreak again in the 2010s and 2017 and 18, as we were holding our conference. These cases of mass murder and ethnic cleansing escalated into genocide against the Rohingya Muslims in Burma. But this all began in the aftermath of Ne Win's visit to Pol Pot's regime in Burma. There are also some other connections that don't rise to the level of genocide, but were intimately connected with the political violence and indeed the Vietnam War. One of the first insurgencies to break out in Southeast Asia after the war, at the time of the Indonesian War of Independence, was an ethnic Chinese-led communist insurgency in Malaya at the time of its continued colonization by the British, who'd returned after World War II. And the Malayan Communist Party, led by ethnic Chinese, the minority in Malaya, rebelled against the British rule. And one of the leading British counterinsurgency experts who helped in putting down that rebellion was later transferred by agreement between the British and the South Vietnamese leader Ngo Dinh Diem, and also agreement of the Malayan leader Tunku Abdul Rahman, who was also involved in this. He was later transferred to give special advice to the South Vietnamese government in the counterinsurgency in South Vietnam. There was also an uprising in the Philippines after World War II, and an American advisor who was deeply involved in the repression and successful counterinsurgency of the Hook Rebellion, as it was known in the Philippines, also was transferred to Vietnam later and was very involved in the counterinsurgency in Vietnam in the 1960s. These were both prominent advisors in the Philippines and Malaya, who later became involved under US auspices with the South Vietnamese government and its attempt to repress the communist insurgencies. So the connections between the violence in Southeast Asia became even personal. They were not just the long-term historical conditions, but also these personal connections, which were quite important to identify.
I mean, I think that comes across very clearly in some of the chapters in the book, the way that there's this web of connections between these different atrocities and genocides, and the idea that kind of genocide was being exported, and people would come and learn about how to do it and then take it over to Myanmar. Pretty terrifying. I'd like to jump back to you, Professor Zucker, and ask you to kind of fill out a little some of the breadth of the book that Professor Kiernan has been talking about. I know that in the book you draw out several themes that cross many of the different chapters, and I wonder if you could tell us about some of those larger themes and some of the ideas that you're trying to help people understand as they process these different genocides and different atrocities that you cover in the book.
Yeah, certainly. And one of the things I guess I want to say, just following on a little bit from the tail end of what Ben was saying and what you were just saying a minute ago about some of the overlaps and connections, and you can call this a theme if you will. But one of them certainly is the colonial history that occurred before, that many of all the nations pretty much except for Thailand had experienced. And then within the context of the book, we're starting in just the 1945, World War II is over, and this sort of marks the end for many of the countries, not all, of colonialism. Obviously, there was the first Indochina War then that took place in Vietnam. The French weren't quite ready to leave. But you also had the Cold War that came after that. And that really, is part of those connections of the episodes of violence, because, and Ben talks about, talks about this also in the introduction, these links between foreign involvement, particularly CIA involvement in Indonesia and in Cambodia, and also in Thailand and in other parts of Southeast Asia as well. So you have, they're linked in many different ways. But now I'll turn to some of the more thematic links I was going to talk about and leave the political part behind just for the moment. So one of the really dominant things, and it's kind of interesting because as in the opening I was talking about, 2018, and there's all this flux and all this change going on, and political change and social change, and that sort of comes through thematically through a number of the chapters, that one of the sort of contributing factors or the context in which violence seems to outbreak in many of these places happens within these times when there's a lot of political flux going on, and also often social as well. It's not just political, it could also be economic as well. So some examples of that are in periods of civil war, or in independence, or establishing a new type of government of some sort. So one of the examples of that, of course, is the case of Myanmar. I'll start there, where in these later episodes of attacks against the Rohingya minority population, that's happening, in 2016 and 2017 and so forth. That's happening, I guess, back 2012 as well. That's happening in this context where where democracy has now entered the country, and so they're becoming a democratic country, and yet, this causes to emerge all these uncertainties about who we are as a nation, who belongs as citizens, and who does not. And apparently, for some, and for the state, for the army, and several others, the Rohingya were considered not a member that belongs to the Burmese democratic nation. And the chapters in the book, if you'll find that there's these emerging themes, coming up about identity of who we are as a nation, who belongs, who doesn't belong, who are the others, and this sort of existential anxiety that that emerges, and this feeling of being somehow losing something, that, you know, we're all going to be a part of this democracy, but maybe we might lose something if this other group is there. And that kind of idea of these potentially dangerous others and threat to the nation or threat to autonomy comes up in other cases. I'm going to go into that in just a second a little more, but just on this transition still, a couple other examples of that would include, for example, in Indonesia, when there was the attempted coup d'etat in '65, you know, the September 30th movement on October 1st, then when you had then Suharto taking power from Sukarno, and then in this change of government, of leadership, then you have then this sort of chaotic period that happened. And then there was simultaneously these massacres against the so-called communists, up to 1 million, perhaps, that were brutally murdered in horrible ways throughout that year. And but that happened in this context again of like of establishing a new government, ousting the old government, and also casting a group as others and not belonging and as a threat to the nation. So we saw that again there. You know, a third example would be in Cambodia during, more than one example in Cambodia actually, but one of the cases was after Sihanouk was ousted in a coup in 1970 and replaced with Lon Nol, and the country was in the middle of fighting a civil war with the Khmer Rouge. That's when you started having attacks on the ethnic Vietnamese minority then, and that's discussed by two of the authors in the book as well. And there again, it's this existential anxiety happening, and the threat of the other that might swallow up the nation. And that's interpreted in all kinds of ways, in political ways, social ways, and also in religious ways. So you could see that these transitions are dangerous times. You could even consider the Khmer Rouge period itself a very sort of transitional period, because it was such a radical shift from one form of government and one economic and social system to something radically different. And then with all you again have this situation where there's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty of categories of who is an enemy and who is not an enemy, and who, you know, is a threat to the nation. And then you start getting this language that you see in other genocides of this other as being a virus of some sort, a contaminant of some sort that might pollute the system, that might destroy the state from within. So that's something I think that reading across the different cases comes up. Both the dangers of the transformative periods, and also the ambiguity and the ascribing otherness to some particular group, often a minority, usually minorities, that people who are considered, you know, a bit more marginal or liminal. You even see that in Duterte, you know, in the chapter, in Al McCoy's chapter, with the war on drugs. The people that are being killed are the people who are the so-called drug dealers, who are, you know, on the margins of society. So that's some of the prominent themes that go through it. Another theme that comes through that's also connected to ambiguity has to do with leadership. And that's in some cases, particularly in the Cambodian cases, with the Khmer Rouge, there was a lot of vagueness at times of what the orders were coming down and what were the expectations of the leadership, which gave room for the imagination sometimes to imagine different ways of what the leaders might be looking for, which might have led to some of the brutality, and also led to different levels of violence in different places, because the orders were being interpreted differently in different places. It also led to, in the case of Tol Sleng, as in one of the chapters by Daniel Bultmann, he talks about the torture, well, the guards and torturers in Tol Sleng trying to also figure out and appease the leaders and give them what they want in pretty graphically horrific ways. So that's another. And then the last one I just want to touch on quickly, because it's so rife throughout the book and that we see over and over again, is that of the impunity of the leaders in many cases, that not only happened in the past, but happens today. I mean, obviously with Suharto and the army and the gangsters that carried out some of his orders, there, as is very clear if you've seen the act of killing, there's been, there's been no accountability, no trials or anything for the people who committed those crimes in Indonesia. But that's also true for, Duterte openly says that kills people, and that's, okay, there's impunity there. And for Thailand, Tyrell Habercorn, she has a whole chapter that talks specifically about impunity, the impunity of the Thai state, and how people are imprisoned and so forth, and there's no recourse. So that's comes through, I believe, all of the cases as well in varying forms. So that's, yeah, there's more themes as well, but I could leave it at that for the moment.
Those themes, the ones you've mentioned, are chilling because, well, I mean, I'm coming from a context of talking about the Holocaust most frequently, and I hear many of those same themes that you're bringing up from the examples from post-1945 in Southeast Asia as also striking a lot of common chords with the Holocaust. And maybe I'll ask you, Ben, this about similarities or differences maybe between looking at the Holocaust and looking at what took place in Cambodia or in Southeast Asia in this period. Are there notable ways in which really we shouldn't be talking about these at the same time, or are there ways where comparisons maybe are appropriate?
Well, obviously there are unique features of each of these cases. For instance, the Indonesian mass murders of 500,000 to 1 million communists was largely a case of political mass murder. The Cambodian case was a mixture of political mass murder and ethnic genocide, as I mentioned earlier, against religious and ethnic minorities. And that's where I think the comparison with the Holocaust of the Jews in Nazi Germany is a partial comparison. The racism of the Khmer Rouge, as well as its communist ideology, made for a rather mixed ideology that shared not only Cambodian nationalism, but also an imported vision of communism, particularly Stalinism and Maoism, but also a virulent racism, particularly against ethnic Vietnamese or against all Vietnamese in the ideology of the Khmer Rouge regime, particularly Pol Pot himself, as recounted by Nguyen Chia, his number 2, in a book called Beyond the Killing Fields, based on long interviews with Nguyen Chia, testifying to Pol Pot's racism. And the racism led to a genocide of all remaining ethnic Vietnamese in Cambodia. 99% of them, very tiny number, survived of the ethnic Vietnamese community in Cambodia, survived the Pol Pot regime. A large number were expelled forcibly. Some of them were slaughtered on the way out. And then of those who remained in 1977-78, about 20,000 in my estimation, 99% of them were killed. The very small number survived, and some of them testified in the tribunal, the UN-sponsored tribunal, which found that genocide had taken place and found both Nuon Chea and Kusempon guilty of that genocide. There was also genocide against the ethnic Cham Muslims, which resulted in nearly 40%, between 36% in my estimate and 41% in the estimate of a demographer, of the Chams being killed or dying of persecution in the 4 years or less than 4 years of the Pol Pot regime. Whereas the number of Cambodians of the majority Khmer ethnic group was also extremely large. About in all, about 1.7 million people died in less than 4 years, and most of them were of the Khmer majority. Many of them died through political mass murder and other forms of class-based slaughter, such as being accused of being capitalists or feudalists, along with the racial genocides that I mentioned. But there were also a huge number of victims of what you might call genocide, which I do because of the way the ethnic Khmer majority victims in many cases were targeted. They were accused of being Khmer bodies with Vietnamese minds. And this was a form of internalized racism where the racism of the regime turned in against its own people. And in the last 6 months of the regime, the entire eastern zone of the country, the entire population of more than 1.5 million people, were targeted for slaughter. The regime was overthrown before it could complete that slaughter, but about 250,000, at least 100,000, possibly 250,000 people of the eastern zone, mostly Khmer peasants, were just murdered in mass on the grounds, on the accusation that they had Vietnamese minds. This is obviously a case of, under the Genocide Convention, the intent to destroy part of a national group, as the Genocide Convention stipulates, and the racism behind it is quite clear. Other members of the Khmer majority were killed for class reasons or for social reasons or for political reasons, and they those murders qualify as crimes against humanity. But there are parallels with the genocides of the Nazi regime and its Holocaust of the Jews and the Gypsies and the Poles, and other parallels with the mass murders of Soviet POWs committed by the Nazis as well. And even the case of the huge number, more than 1 million, of members of the Khmer majority, crimes against humanity in most cases, has parallels in the actions of Hitler and the other Nazis, because racism is often not just purely murdering members of other ethnic groups. It's a program that sets up unending racial conflict with great cost in the lives of people on both sides of the ethnic divide. Not only did Hitler kill nearly 6 million Jews, but nearly that many Germans died in the wars that the Hitler regime provoked and the aggression that it carried out against neighboring countries. Of course, the proportion of Jews who died in the Holocaust was much greater as a proportion of the Jewish communities in continental Europe than the proportion of Germans who died, but the absolute numbers were roughly similar, although the Germans who died were mostly military casualties. Military casualties alone, however, nearly rivaled German military casualties, nearly rivaled the numbers of Jews. Now, this wasn't racial mass murder. It was Hitler saying that he had the right to sacrifice large numbers of Germans in his racial war against Jews and Russians and Slavs, including Poles and Gypsies. And so there are parallels, I think, between the Khmer Rouge and the Nazis, even though the Khmer Rouge were a communist regime and they carried out communist class slaughters as well. Now, there are also connections of the kinds that I was talking about before that were intensifying in the Southeast Asian countries that were different from the more attenuated connections between the Southeast Asian countries before the Second World War. Thailand, for instance, was the only country in Southeast Asia that was not colonized by a European or American power in the case of the Philippines. But Thailand became much more integrated after 1945 in the rest of Southeast Asia. It sent 25 battalions to fight alongside the Americans in Laos. And 2/3 of the American planes that bombed northern Vietnam took off from Thai air bases established by the United States in Thailand. And so one of the results, or one of the signs of the interconnectedness of the Southeast Asian countries, which our book illustrates, I think, is that after World War II, after 1945, the Southeast Asian countries became much more interconnected. However, they remained distinct. And one of the distinguishing features of the Southeast Asian countries, I think, is that the result of the Vietnam War. As I mentioned, in Malaya, the British were quite successful in putting down the Chinese communist insurgency in Malaya, and the Americans and the later independent Philippine government of Magsaysay were able to put down the Huk Rebellion. But the advisors, the British and American advisors from those two countries, when they went to Vietnam in an attempt to engage in the counterinsurgency in Vietnam, they were quite unsuccessful because the land tenure problem, the high rate of landlessness in Vietnam was much greater than it was in either Malaya or in the Philippines, where in both those cases, it was regional rather than national. But in South Vietnam, the degree of landlessness and the inequality of land ownership was much greater, and it wasn't possible to isolate the problem the way it had been in Malaya and the Philippines. So even though these countries were becoming more integrated and the connections were becoming greater, the distinctiveness of the Southeast Asian countries was also very important in the post-war history of Southeast Asia.
Well, thanks very much. And I think we might come back to some of those points, I hope, in a few minutes with some questions. But I want to get to one more question for Professor Zucker, and then maybe we can open it up. And I know there's a question already out there, and I think there's a few more coming. But if I could ask you, Professor Zucker, to talk about that, one of the items that you started with early on, which is about collective memory and about how we remember these events that you've been describing and the Professor Kiernan have been describing. You know, I'm coming again from a Holocaust museum. I'm well aware about efforts in the US to remember the Holocaust. Are there kind of similar efforts like that going on in Southeast Asia to remember those histories, or maybe in the United States? How do we sustain these histories?
Right, thank you. For Southeast Asia, it depends on the case. They're not all the same. You know, Cambodia has been really, I would say, success case in terms of its efforts to memorialize the not only the atrocities that occurred under the Khmer Rouge, but also to honor the victims and to provide spaces for their stories to be heard. It wasn't always the case. I mean, that things really have changed quite a lot in Cambodia over the years. It wasn't like, oh, right after the genocide happened, then all these sort of processes were taking place. It took time, as it did with the Holocaust as well. And one of the one of the places where you could see this actually quite well, I think, is at the Tol Sleng, well, what's the Tol Sleng? One time it was a high school, then it became the Tol Sleng Prison and Torture Center under the Khmer Rouge, and later became the Tol Sleng Museum of Genocidal Crimes, which it is today. And at this, when it was a prison under the Khmer Rouge, that was a place where many, especially Khmer Rouge cadres, sometimes with their families, were incarcerated there and tortured, having to produce forced confessions, and then taken off site and executed. Something in the range, the numbers seem to aren't exactly clear, but maybe between 15 and 18,000 prisoners went through there, and none survived except for like literally a handful. And when the Vietnamese came in early 1979, when they came into the prison, what they found there was a few prisoners still there, and bodies and all the things as they were. The Khmer Rouge just left everything as it was. And they decided then that what they would do is they would make a museum out of it, and modeling it on concentration camps in Europe. And so they created a museum, and they'd have groups come in to see the museum from time to time. And this was part of their overall way of framing the past and their presence in Cambodia as liberators from the Pol Pot regime. And so they not only had the prison, but they also had books and educational programs. And they also established, as you mentioned in the opening of the session, the Day of Hate, as it's sometimes called, or as it was called then. The translation's not exactly that, sort of like making anger, tying it, in fact. So that started then in 1984. And then the prison, after the Vietnamese left in 1989, and then the UN was there, and the prison stayed open then, was open to the public. But if you were to visit the prison in the early 90s, what you would see is not that many visitors there altogether. And in the visits I made to the prison, I never saw Cambodians visiting there. I saw Cambodians working there, but not visiting there to see what had happened. And so you could see that the process of looking into the past and contending with the past, it was still really at its nascency. And people were writing memoirs, particularly, Cambodians abroad were writing memoirs, and there started being more information coming out, but it really didn't get going till we started to move to the later 90s and the 2000s, where then, we began with the preparations for the tribunal, and more memorials were made. And films started being made. Richie Pond is making films, and the whole process really started getting going. And actually, in the book, there's a chapter about Richie Pond's making the film S21 while the with the tribunal, taking place, and he's interviewing these guards at the prison. And he also has there at the prison, a couple of the survivors are there also in the film talking to their former perpetrators. So it's really, really quite interesting, and it's an interesting period. And I'm not saying that the tribunal was the only source that allowed for collective memory processes to take place, because in my work, which was very far from Phnom Penh, I could see other processes taking place that had nothing to do with the international community, where people were talking about, as Ben mentioned earlier, the violent episodes that occurred in earlier times, such as in the 1800s, where people, in telling those stories, would make comparisons and start talking about the Khmer Rouge. Oh, they came and they smashed, the big drum, and they were smashing statues. And in Khmer Rouge time, just like the Khmer Rouge time, they were smashing statues. So you see this sort of comparisons, which like as in the, with the Holocaust, sometimes with Passover, the story of, the oppression and the terrible atrocities and so forth that occurred in the story of Passover. Sometimes people bring up the Holocaust. In fact, it's in some of the Passover Haggadah. So you saw kind of a similar way of embedding sort of the story of the Khmer Rouge within a longer history of atrocities. So that was one thing I noticed taking place, as well as other processes as well. So now if you visit Tol Saleng, it's not when it's not COVID times, mind you. Now if you visit Tol Saleng, there are local Cambodian visitors from other provinces and so forth visiting the museum. It's also a very busy place now with visitors from all over, and with earphones given with translations in different languages and so forth. So it's really come a very long way from where it is. And now we also have, we see in addition to the memorials and the obviously the all the recordings of what happened in the courts and the confessions and not the confessions, well, in some cases, like in the case of the head of the prison of Tol Saleng, in his case, it was a confession, but also the victims' testimonies. So there's a lot more to sort of grasp onto in terms of collective memory. And at the same time, we see many new forms, many digital forms taking place on social media. There's apps for your smartphone with Khmer Rouge history on it. As I mentioned, films and photography and lots of sources in YouTube videos. There's millions of YouTube videos out there of with footage from the Khmer Rouge time. So it's a really different situation now than it was a few years ago. And let's see how we're doing on time here.
Yeah, I want to make time for a couple of other questions from the audience. So yeah.
Yeah, so I'll just leave it at that then, and just one last little piece on the Day of Remembrance. It became the day we were talking about 2018 before. Well, that was when it became the Day of Remembrance, and turned the focus instead of just looking at the terrible atrocities that the Khmer Rouge did to turning it towards remembering and honoring the victims.
Yeah, it's interesting to go from the day of hate or the day of rage to national remembrance. There's very much a kind of switch there from focusing on the perpetrators to focusing on the victims, it seems. I agree with you.
And that was one of the reparations that was called for in the Tribunal.
I see that we have a question from somebody, and I just want to read some of it to you. The person says, I'm one of the victims of the genocidal regime. Like many others, I lost my mother, my two brothers, my sister in the killing fields. And then they ask a question about, I guess to some degree, could this have been avoided? And then the person writes, given that my country, Cambodia, was the site of a bloody proxy war between the US and the diehard communist supporters. And so I'll pose that question to you. Was this something in Cambodia that was caused by this proxy war? Was there more to it than that? What kind of blame should we put on the United States?
Ben, did you want to take that question?
I think the war spilled over into Cambodia from the Vietnam War. So there was an insurgency led by Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge insurgents starting in 1967, but it wasn't very successful against Prince Sihanouk's neutral Cambodian government. It only began to expand after the overthrow of Prince Sihanouk and the expansion of the Vietnam War into Cambodia and the bombing of Cambodia by the United States Air Force. Now that had begun in 1965 on a small scale when the US tactical bombing began in 1965 in an attempt to bomb Vietnamese communist forces that were hiding in Cambodia along the border. But in 1969, still under Prince Sihanouk's government, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon authorized a strategic bombing campaign of very high-flying B-52s, what they called the Menu bombing campaign, which was much more destructive, and it was much more expanded. And for a year, it was kept secret until after the overthrow of Prince Sihanouk in March 1970. And then it expanded much more, expanded right across the country as the two sides in the Vietnam War spread across Cambodia in 1970, 71, 72. The bombing of Cambodia by the United States Air Force, particularly B-52s, but also fighter aircraft, spread across the country until Congress brought it to a halt on August 15th, 1973. The bombing was very destructive, not only of communist forces, both Vietnamese and Cambodian communist forces, but it was also very destructive of civilian Cambodian villages and in rural areas of individual Cambodians. I estimate the number of casualties of people killed in rural Cambodia from US bombing at between 50,000 and 150,000, probably closer to the higher end, at least 100,000 in my estimation. There are plenty of stories of weddings being bombed, funeral marches being bombed by US aircraft. In many cases, the United States Pentagon sent out aircraft that did not know what they were bombing. When they released their bombs, they didn't know what they were hitting. And this has been proved by databases that the Pentagon kept. Many of their targets were recorded as unknown or unidentified in the Pentagon database. But in fact, many of the targets or many of the people hit were civilians, and the Khmer Rouge made heavy use in their propaganda of the American bombing by saying that these killing birds, as they called the bombing aircraft, came from Phnom Penh. In other words, from the Lon Nol regime. In fact, as I mentioned, they came from Thailand, US bases, or from Guam, or even from the Philippines. And they were not sent out by the Lon Nol regime to bomb Cambodia's countryside. But the Khmer Rouge told the villagers that they came from Phnom Penh. They directed all the anger of the targeted villagers against the Lon Nol regime, against the Lon Nol army. They recruited heavily on the basis of the bombing. And in fact, the Khmer Rouge grew from a few thousand guerrillas, as I mentioned, in 1969, to more than 200,000 troops and militia in 1973. And this enabled the Khmer Rouge, with the support of Prince Sihanouk, who joined them after being overthrown by Lon Nol, and the support of the Vietnamese communists, but particularly with the recruiting weapon of being able to say that the United States were bombing Cambodia and causing all that destruction. The Khmer Rouge were able to recruit a large army and win the war in 1975, refusing to negotiate in the meantime. The Vietnamese communists negotiated with the United States and reached a unstable peace, which eventually fell apart. But the Khmer Rouge never negotiated with the United States or with the Lon Nol regime, but pushed on after the bombing ended and destroyed the Lon Nol regime and instituted a genocidal dictatorship. Now, could that have been prevented? It's hard to say at what point it could have been prevented, but I think it's true that if the neutral regime of Prince Sihanouk had been left alone by both sides in the Vietnam War, and particularly the strongest global power at the time, the United States, the Khmer Rouge genocide wouldn't have happened.
Am I right that, given what Professor Zucker said as one of the themes about genocides emerging out, or maybe you said it, emerging out of these chaotic transitional periods, a nation under wide-scale bombing is obviously going to be forced into a transitional period, and in this case, this genocide emerged from it.
Yeah, I think we need to look at the causes of genocide, and they're both long-term and short-term or immediate causes. The long-term causes are in various places, poverty, political disruption, or war, massive dislocation of stable societies, and so on. I think that happened in Cambodia. But then the immediate causes are the decisions by the Khmer Rouge to conduct these genocidal campaigns against both their own people, including ethnic minorities, including the Chams and the Vietnamese minority, but also against their own Khmer majority, but also against people across borders who are their neighbors. The Khmer Rouge attacked all three of their neighboring countries, Thailand, Laos, and Vietnam. They slaughtered people across all three borders. These are decisions that the Pol Pot regime made. It wasn't a result of long-term historical factors. It was immediate causes, decisions made by a genocidal regime. These are the immediate factors. But they wouldn't have had an army with which to do that if it hadn't been for the long-term historical factors, which enabled them to come to power based on their recruiting of that army.
I know we're past our time and I want to wrap us up, but I did read, and I think that the early celebrations or marking of this day in Cambodia were not only directed anger against the Khmer Rouge, but there was also anger against the United States for our involvement in it as part of that sense of rage. I don't know if that resonates with what you're familiar with.
I think at the time of the Day of Rage, there was behind the Cambodian government of the time in the 1980s, there was rage about countries that supported the Khmer Rouge in the United Nations. Even though it was an exiled, overthrown, defeated government, it had still an army in Thailand. It had a seat in the UN. I think that was the extent of, although there was, if you like, political resentment about the war back in the early 1970s, I think the animosity that was directed against the United States in the 1980s was about supporting the Khmer Rouge in the UN, voting for it to represent its victims in the UN.
Well, thank you for that clarification and expansion. I want to wrap us up. I want to thank both of you, Professor Zucker, Professor Kiernan, for joining us and for sharing something about the breadth of what's in your book and for helping us, the Holocaust Memorial and Tolerance Center, at least draw attention to Cambodia's National Remembrance Day and to make us think more about this and to broaden our minds and to think about other genocides and other atrocities that have gone on since the Holocaust. Sometimes I think at our Holocaust Center, we tend to think about the Holocaust, and this is a good opportunity for our members to be thinking more broadly. So thank you for sharing your expertise with us. And to our visitors out there, I want to just thank you for joining us, and I hope that you'll join us in some other programs soon. Thanks very much, and enjoy your evening, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.